A single candle burns low on a wooden table. A worn Bible lies open, its pages soft from years of use. Someone sits quietly, tracing a finger across a highlighted verse. This image feels familiar, peaceful even. But what if the comfort you've been drawing from this moment is built on a misunderstanding? Jeremiah 29, verse 11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Most people encounter this verse on greeting cards, phone wallpapers, and motivational posts. It gets quoted at graduations, whispered in hospital rooms, and shared in moments of personal uncertainty. It has become the go-to verse for reassurance, a spiritual safety net for anyone navigating difficulty. But the version most people carry in their minds has been quietly stripped of its original weight. What remains is a promise without its context, a comfort without its cost. And that gap between what the verse says and what it actually meant is where most people get stuck. To understand this verse, you have to understand who received it first. This was not written to people living in peace. It was not written to a thriving community enjoying the blessings of obedience. It was written to the people of Judah, a nation that had been conquered, uprooted, and marched into Babylon as captives. They were living under foreign rule, separated from their homeland, stripped of their temple, their identity, and their sense of divine favor. They were not in a season of waiting for something better. They were in a season of consequence. God had warned them repeatedly through the prophets. They had ignored those warnings, pursued idolatry, and broken covenant. The exile was not random suffering. It was the direct result of prolonged disobedience. And it was into that specific context that Jeremiah wrote this letter. Not to people who were simply going through a hard time, to people who were under judgment, people who had earned their circumstances through years of spiritual compromise. That is the audience. That is the setting. And when you understand that, the verse stops sounding like a motivational quote and starts sounding like something far more serious. The letter Jeremiah sent to the exiles did not begin with comfort. It began with instructions. Build houses, plant gardens, marry, have children. Seek the peace of the city where you have been sent. Pray for it, because your peace is tied to its peace. In other words, settle in. This is going to take longer than you want it to. 70 years, God said, not 70 days, not a short season of inconvenience. An entire generation would live and die in Babylon before the promise of return would be fulfilled. The people receiving this letter would not personally see the restoration they were hoping for. Their children might. Their grandchildren likely would. But them? They were being called to remain faithful inside a process they would never fully see completed. That is the context of Jeremiah 29, verse 11. God was not saying your circumstances are about to change. He was saying your purpose remains intact even while your circumstances stay hard. He was not promising relief. He was promising that the suffering had direction, that the exile had an end point, even if that end point was beyond their personal timeline. That is a profoundly different message than what most people carry when they quote this verse. When this verse gets pulled out of its context and applied as a personal guarantee of immediate success, something important gets lost. People begin to treat faith as a transaction. They believe that if they simply hold on to this promise, God is obligated to deliver comfort, opportunity, and favorable outcomes on a timeline that suits them. When those outcomes do not arrive quickly, doubt sets in. The verse that was supposed to provide strength instead becomes a source of confusion. Why hasn't it worked yet? Why am I still struggling? Did God forget about me? These questions emerge not because God failed, but because the expectation was built on a misreading. The verse was never a guarantee of speed. It was never a promise that the process would feel good. It was a declaration that even inside a long, painful, disorienting season, purpose was still present. The people in Babylon were not forgotten. They were being refined. And the same principle applies today. The difficulty you are in does not mean the promise has been cancelled. It may mean you are inside the very process the promise requires. There is a version of faith that is entirely passive. It waits, it hopes, it quotes verses and expects circumstances to shift without any corresponding action. But that is not the faith described in Scripture, and it is not the faith demonstrated by the exiles who actually received this letter. They were told to build, to plant, to pray, to engage. They were called to live faithfully inside a situation they did not choose and could not immediately escape. That is a demanding form of faith. It requires discipline when motivation is absent. It requires consistency when results are invisible. It requires obedience in the specific areas where obedience is most uncomfortable, where it costs something real. The disciplined routine of someone who genuinely believes in this verse looks different from someone who simply quotes it. It shows up in how they manage their time, how they handle their responsibilities, how they respond to setbacks, and how they treat the small, unglamorous obligations of daily life. Faith that does not produce obedience is not faith in the biblical sense. It is preference. It is wishful thinking dressed in spiritual language. Most people want the outcome described in the promise, the hope, the future, the prosperity, but they want it without the 70 years, they want it without the exile, they want the destination without the desert. And that desire, understandable as it is, creates a version of faith that collapses under pressure because it was never built to carry weight. The real question this verse asks of every person who reads it is not, do you believe God has good plans for you? Most people will say yes to that. The real question is, are you willing to remain obedient inside a process you do not fully understand, on a timeline you did not choose, toward an outcome you may not personally live to see? That is the weight of this verse. That is what it was asking of the exiles. And that is what it asks of anyone who genuinely takes it seriously today. This verse was never written to make you comfortable. It was written to keep you faithful under pressure. Those are two entirely different goals. Comfort seeks to remove the difficulty. Faithfulness asks you to remain steady inside it. The people who actually walk out the meaning of this verse are not the ones who feel the most peace in the moment. They are the ones who keep showing up, in prayer, in discipline, in obedience, even when the process feels long, even when the results are not visible, even when the circumstances have not changed. There is one area in every person's life where they already know obedience is required. Not theoretically, specifically. A habit that needs to change. A commitment that keeps getting delayed. A discipline that gets abandoned the moment it becomes inconvenient. That is the place this verse is speaking to. Not the easy areas, the hard ones, the ones where the gap between what you know and what you do is widest. That gap is where faith either becomes real or remains decorative. The promise is real, the process is real, and the only path from one to the other runs directly through obedience.